Hello, Tributes, and welcome to the second episode of Tales of Xebec. This episode will contain the files of the 11th through the 20th Hunger Games. Hope you all enjoy, and may the odds be ever in your favor. The 11th Hunger Games took place in a Siberian tundra. The weather was extremely snowy. The games lasted for a week. Notable months were hungry polar bears and tameable Arctic foxes. After last year's games, the capital had finally finished construction on the first arena outside of the old amphitheater. This year saw the first male victor. This year's victor was 18-year-old Pierre Dupont from District 1. When the gong sounded, Pierre ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a sword before running into the snowy wilderness. As Pierre ran through the Siberian wilderness, the snow got worse and worse. Pierre ran into a nearby building when the snow got too bad for him. Pierre then fell asleep in the building. Meanwhile, a lot of other tributes were dying to the cold. Pierre was woken up in the middle of the night when he heard something. He jumped a little as he looked down and saw an Arctic fox cuddling up next to him. Pierre just looked down at the fox until it woke and ran off, hiding in the shadows. Pierre eventually stepped out of the building and started to roam around the arena. Eventually he noticed that the fox was now following him. Pierre decided to name the fox Blaze, and the two started to grow a pretty close bond. Pierre would start to hunt for food with Blaze and feed him half of the food he gathered. Eventually, Blaze introduced Pierre to his pack, and he also built a strong bond with these Arctic foxes. On the second day in the arena, Pierre and Blaze were hunting with Blaze's pack. Soon the group ran into another tribute. Pierre ducked behind a tree with Blaze, while the other Arctic foxes stood at attention and growled at the tribute. Then Pierre heard a familiar voice. It was his district partner, Chloe. Pierre ran out of his hiding spot and hugged Chloe, saying that he missed her. At first, the Arctic foxes didn't trust her, but they eventually warmed up to her. Pierre and Chloe also grew pretty close to each other, and in no time at all, they started to get intimate. The foxes looked into the forest around the pair and watched for any other tributes. Eventually, the pair heard the foxes growling at something. Pierre and Chloe immediately got up and got dressed before walking over to where the foxes were. When they saw who it was, they immediately ducked behind a tree. Who they had seen was the career pack, who consisted of the tributes from districts 0, 2, 4, 14, and 15. Pierre and Chloe were terrified. They were given a choice by the careers to either join the alliance or get targeted. Pierre and Chloe chose to get targeted instead of joining the careers, although they were from a career district. In a moment, Pierre jumped out from behind the tree and ran at the careers. Chloe then threw a sword to Pierre and grabbed her own sword before running at the careers as well. Pierre easily killed Antonio from 4, Antonia from 4, Ella from 15, Paul from 15, and Anna from 14. But Chloe, on the other hand, killed Marie from 0, Arthur from 0, Andre from 14, and Julia from 2, but Adrian from 2 managed to get the upper hand over Chloe and kill her. Pierre then got mad. He ran at Adrian and swung his sword. Pierre's sword sliced through the air and hit Adrian in the neck. When Adrian's cannon sounded, the foxes immediately calmed down. That night, Pierre actually cried himself to sleep. Pierre missed Chloe already and was still pissed off at the careers for taking her away from him. As he slept, Blaze cuddled up next to him to keep Pierre warm. When Pierre woke up on the third day, he immediately went out to hunt. Blaise and his pack ate well like they usually do, but Pierre couldn't stop thinking about Chloe and couldn't eat. Pierre didn't even want to roam the arena like they normally would after eating. Blaise cuddled up against Pierre as Pierre started to fall asleep again after they ate. On the dawn of the 7th day, Pierre realized it was just him and Sophia from -1 left in the arena. Pierre then ran to the cornucopia and saw Sophia. Sophia was relatively easy to kill, although she made it this far. After Pierre killed Sophia, he was crowned the victor. After the games, Pierre returned home to District 1, where he was celebrated for his victory, but he had a goal. He knew that if he didn't adopt Blaise in his pack, that the capital would put them down, so Pierre went to the capital and asked to adopt the foxes, and to his surprise, they said yes. After he adopted Blaise in his pack, Pierre named the rest of the foxes. The names he chose were Bailey, Bella, Buddy, Charlie, Coco, and Max, and of course, Blaise. He loved his foxes and was happy. He eventually moved to District 19, where he met 2 future victors and his future wife. These 2 people were Kyrilo Kovalenko and Alina Adamovich. The 12th Hunger Games took place in an arena in an African desert. The weather was scorching hot temperatures. The games lasted for 2 days, and the notable mutts were camels. After last year's games, Pierre was one of the capital's favorite victors. Even though the capital had not yet achieved victory, they still loved the way that last year's games turned out, and were excited to see how this year's games would turn out. This year's victor was 17-year-old Hans Schmidt from District 13. When the gong sounded, Hans ran into the cornucopia with his alliance, which consisted of him, his district partner Marie, Athena and Achilles, both from 9, and Sky from 10. Hans grabbed a sword and immediately targeted Leonardo from 4. Leonardo ran in and grabbed a sword as well, so he was well equipped for this fight. When the sword fight began, Capitalites cheered for Leonardo, as he was the favorite to win. To the surprise of the capital, Hans easily defeated Leonardo. After Hans killed Leonardo, he ran back to his allies. Hans was relieved to see that all of his allies were still alive. Hans and his allies then ran into the scorching hot desert. When they got a safe distance away from the cornucopia, they set up camp in the shadow of some nearby trees surrounding a drinking hole. Later that night, Hans, Marie, and Achilles went out hunting for food, while Sky and Athena hung out at the camp. As Hans and the small group hunted, they heard screams and cannons coming from their campsite. When the group returned, they saw Athena and Sky lying dead on the ground next to the dead bodies of Luca from 4 and Francis from 1. They correctly assumed that the girls were able to fight Luca and Francis, but unable to fight the other careers. After this, there was an announcement made congratulating the surviving groups in the arena on making it to the top 15, and that there would be a feast the next day, where the cornucopia would be replenished with food and supplies. After this announcement, Hans and his group immediately came up with a plan. Hans, Marie, and Achilles waited behind a dune near the cornucopia. Then eventually the careers came into the cornucopia, and Hans nodded at Marie and Achilles. And then Achilles pressed a button they had rigged up, and the entire cornucopia exploded, with the rest of the careers in it. After this, it was just Hans, Marie, and Achilles. In a show of either bravery or stupidity, Marie and Achilles walked off into the fire of the cornucopia, sacrificing themselves so that Hans could win. After the games, Hans returned home, where he would later open the Hans Schmidt Training Academy, which would be closed down later that year so as to not give the outer districts any unfair advantage. Hans then moved to the capital and met Clara Hansen, who he would later start to date while Clara was married. Neither of them cared about the consequences, but eventually Hans and Clara would be caught and sentenced to death. The 13th Hunger Games took place in an abandoned ghost town. The weather was suspiciously dark, the games lasted for 3 days, and the noble mutts were ghosts and demons. The victor this year was 15-year-old Kyrilo Kovalenko from District 19. When Kyrilo was lifted into the arena, he could barely see a thing. His eyes had never grown accustomed to this level of darkness. When the gong sounded, a lot of people stayed still on their podiums, still trying to get a better look at what they were looking at. Kyrilo, however, just ran in. Kyrilo ran into a nearby house, or what he thought was nearby. His eyes finally adjusted to the darkness a few hours later, and he realized he was nowhere near the cornucopia. At first he questioned this, seeing as he didn't feel like he ran this far, but he soon dismissed this. Later that night, he heard the sound of the Horn of Plenty playing, and he jumped at the sound of every cannon that sounded. In total, there were 19 cannons that sounded, most of them actually being careers. At this point, Kyrilo just wanted to go home. The next day, Kyrilo woke up to the sound of another cannon. Just like yesterday, he knew that the cannons for today wouldn't stop there. Kyrilo just stayed where he was and leaned his back up against the wall. Soon enough, however, he heard something above him, footsteps. Kyrilo was very scared at first, but he knew if he didn't act fast, that any breath he took could be his last. Kyrilo snuck slowly upstairs, only to see nothing, and better yet, no one. Kyrilo was confused by this, and didn't know what to do. Just then he heard a sound from directly behind him, so he quickly turned around to see nothing but a mirror. Kyrilo slowly and hesitantly made his way to the mirror and looked into it. It took a few seconds for Kyrilo to realize that something was behind him in the mirror. Kyrilo screamed and ran out of the house at top speeds, thought to only be achievable by jaguars. Kyrilo couldn't sleep that night, so he just wandered around the arena until the president's voice boomed through the intercoms, saying that he will give the final 2 tributes until morning before forcing them to fight. Kyrilo didn't know how to react at first until he noticed that the president had said that he wasn't gonna force them to fight until morning, so if Kyrilo found the other tribute and killed them in their sleep, there wouldn't be anything wrong with that. Kyrilo hunted for this last tribute for a while until he found Leah from 24. Kyrilo was hesitant at first, but eventually he lifted up his sword and swung it down upon Leah, making him the victor of the Hunger Games that year. After the games, Kyrilo returned home, where he was celebrated for bringing his district their first ever victor. He was loved throughout the capital, too. Kyrilo would eventually move to District -1, where he would meet the future girl of his dreams named Emily Smith. Him and Emily eventually got married and had 20 kids together, 15 daughters and 5 sons. The 14th Hunger Games took place in an abandoned hospital. The weather was rainy, the games lasted for 5 minutes, and the noblenuts were unknown. After the 9th Hunger Games, the capital thought that they would never get a shorter games, but they were about to be proven wrong. This year's victor was 17-year-old Alina Adamovich from District 19. During training, all the non-career tributes unanimously agreed to throw their hands up in a 3-finger salute before stepping off of their podiums in a rebellious action. Before the gong sounded, the non-careers put their plan into action. After this, it only left the tributes of districts 0, 1, 2, 4, 14, 15, 16, 17, 19, 21, X, and A0D, leaving 24 tributes. When the gong sounded, all the careers ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a weapon. To the surprise of the Capitolites watching on TV, the tributes didn't run away from each other, but instead stayed at the cornucopia to fight. After 4 minutes of fighting, it was down to the top 3. The top 3 consisted of Leo from 0, Francis from 1, and Alina from 19. Leo easily sliced his sword across Francis's neck, and then turned to Alina. Leo slowly approached Alina with a smirk on his face. Leo then disarmed Alina and pinned her to the ground. Leo then tried to seduce Alina into giving her body to him. Alina repeatedly told him to get off, but he wouldn't budge. Alina reached for her knife but couldn't reach it. It seemed like there was no way to escape her fate. She thought Leo was going to rape her until a sword pierced Leo's back and he fell off of Alina. Alina then got up to see Francis as she fell back down to the ground, and both her and Leo's cannons sounded, and Alina was crowned the victor. After the games, Alina returned home to District 19, where she was celebrated for bringing another victory to her district. A few months later, Alina asked out Pierre, being the first girl in the history of the Hunger Games to ask out the boy. Of course, Pierre agreed, and they started to date. A few years later, Pierre proposed to Alina, and they got married the next month. They then proceeded to have 19 kids, 17 girls and 2 boys. This family would go on to become a legacy family, much like the Daltons and Panem. The 15th Hunger Games took place in an old train station. The weather was sunny, the games lasted for a day, and the noblenuts were werewolves. After last year's embarrassment of the Hunger Games, the capital was more strict on law enforcement. This year's victor was reaped because of a rigging of the reaping bull after he was caught smuggling drugs into District A0D. This year's victor was 16-year-old Ethan Miller from District A0D. When the gong sounded, Ethan ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a sword. He then proceeded to kill 8 tributes, while his allies, Leo from -1 and Bree from A0D, killed 14 tributes altogether, causing the entire alliance to get 22 kills altogether in the bloodbath. 20 kills were also achieved by people outside of Ethan's alliance. After the bloodbath, there were already only 8 tributes left, including Ethan, Leo, and Bree. The group went into the train station after a little while of waiting out by the cornucopia and found a place to camp. After they found their camp, Ethan went to take the first watch until the 5 other tributes came out of the dark corner of the train station and attacked Ethan's group. Ethan easily killed 4 out of the 5 tributes until Leo and Bree were killed by the last tribute. Ethan then lunged at the last tribute with his sword in hand and stabbed the last tribute through the gut, making Ethan the victor of this year's Hunger Games. After the games, Ethan returned home, where he was celebrated for bringing victory to his district again. To the district again. Meanwhile, in the capital, he was not liked very much, so he made an executive decision to never go to the capital again unless absolutely necessary. The 16th Hunger Games took place in the old amphitheater. The weather was rainy, the games lasted for 2 days, and the notable mutts were destructive termites. After last year's games produced an unpopular victor, the capital was still desperate for a victor of their own. This caused the game makers to try their darndest to make it so that the Capitalites would win no matter what, but they would soon realize that not even rigging the games would work. This year was also the start of a 3-year period of nostalgia, where the Hunger Games would be played in the old amphitheater from the first 10 games. This also marked a 3-year period where ticket sales for rich Capitalites returned just for these nostalgia years. This year's victor was 19-year-old Alexander Kuznetsov from District 18. When the gong sounded, the game makers were prepared for a lot of tributes to run into the cornucopia, but in reality, when the gong sounded, most of the tributes actually ran away from the cornucopia, except for the careers and the capital tributes. The careers made an easy meal out of the capital tributes before running out into the tunnels to find more prey. Meanwhile, Alexander ran through the tunnels until he found where he thought could be considered a safe place to camp out for the night. Later that night, Alexander stayed up late to watch the fallen tributes. When he saw that most of the careers were now dead, leaving only one career in the stadium, Alexander rejoiced in happiness. Alexander then promptly fell asleep. When Alexander woke up, he looked around his surroundings. He had completely forgotten he was reaped for the games, and when he noticed he was in the old amphitheater from earlier on in the games, he screamed. When Alexander was finally done freaking out, the president got onto the comms and congratulated Alexander and another tribute on making it to the top 2. After Alexander heard this announcement, he ran away from his hiding spot and went straight to the cornucopia. When Alexander arrived at the cornucopia, he grabbed the only remaining sword there before the last tribute arrived at the cornucopia. The last tribute was Louise from 1. When Alexander saw Louise, he ran at her. Louise tried to dodge Alexander's attack, but she wasn't quick enough and was stabbed in the throat by Alexander, making Alexander the winner. After the games, Alexander returned home, where he was celebrated for bringing victory to their district again. The capital was also pretty fond of him because of his good looks. Alexander soon met the love of his life and got married and had 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl. The 17th Hunger Games took place in the same old amphitheater. The weather was a heat wave, the game lasted for 10 minutes, and the notable mutts were unknown. After last year's games, the capital loved the nostalgia given to them via the competition being held in the old amphitheater, so this is when they decided to continue it for the next 2 games, up until the 18th/next Hunger Games, which would be the last time they competed in the old amphitheater. This year's victor was 18-year-old Benedito Alves from District 21. When the gong sounded, Benedito immediately felt the heat of the surrounding arena, and he ran into the tunnels, which were filled with the cold air from the AC on the seating above them. Other tributes were smart enough to do this as well. These tributes included Leon from -1, Claire from the capital, and Francis from 1, which Benedetto easily found and killed. The rest of the tributes died off within only a few minutes, making Benedetto the victor. After the games, Benedetto returned home where he was celebrated for his victory. Meanwhile in the capital, Capitalites were already planning for his execution, saying stuff like, "He's not a real victor," and "he didn't deserve the win he got." A few days after the 20th Hunger Games is when one Capitalite would actually put their assassination plan into effect. The 18th Hunger Games took place in the same old amphitheater. The weather was a tsunami, the games lasted for 10 minutes, and the noble nuts were unknown. After last year's games, the capital hated how short they were, and hated the victor as well. This year, they were hoping that the weather wouldn't be as bad. This year's victor was 17-year-old Juan Lopez from District 22. When the gong sounded, Juan already knew something was off. His specialty was oceanography, and he taught it very well. He knew a lot about rain, tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, and other similar things. As soon as the gong sounded, Juan got up as high up as possible before seeing a massive tsunami approaching shore. When the tsunami hit the shore, Juan was the only person high enough off the ground to avoid the wave. Meanwhile, all the other tributes and all the capital spectators died in the wave, making Juan the victor. After the games, Juan returned home. He was celebrated for his victory, while the capital was still left wanting more. Juan eventually moved to the capital, where he would be a side piece for Clara while she was still dating Hans. The 19th Hunger Games took place in the snowy slopes. The weather was an avalanche, the games lasted for 5 hours, and the notable nuts were polar bears. After last year's games, the capital had given up on ever achieving victory. They had lost all of the games they competed in thus far, and they didn't think their losing streak would end. At this point, they accepted their fate. This year's victor was 17-year-old Clara Hansen from the capital. When the gong sounded, Clara ran into the cornucopia. The snow was a new thing for her, but she wasn't about to face the cornucopia. All the capital tributes before her had faced the cornucopia and died in the bloodbath, and she wasn't about to be one of them. Clara ran and ran and ran until she couldn't anymore, and plopped herself down on a nearby rock. Clara stayed perched on that rock until she heard something. It was a coming avalanche. Clara got up off of her rock and ran as fast as she could. The snow caught up with Clara on multiple occasions, and she thought she would die, but she made it out of the avalanche, leaving only her and Isla from -1. Clara looked around the base of the mountain for hours until she found Isla. Clara and Isla fought long and hard until Clara came out on top, to the surprise of a lot of Capitalites. After the games, Clara returned home, where she was celebrated for bringing a victory to her district. Clara eventually met the love of her life and married her at the age of 21. The two girls adopted 14 kids together, 10 girls and 4 boys. The 20th Hunger Games took place in a train. The weather was rainy, the games lasted for 9 hours, and the notable nuts were unknown. After last year's games, the capital was more than happy with Clara's performance and decided to ease down on the districts. This year's victor was 19-year-old Emily Smith from District -1. When the gong sounded, Emily witnessed half of the tributes getting thrown out of the train, while even more being slaughtered by the careers, before one brave tribute tackled all of the careers out of the train. Emily was terrified, and so she ran away from the cornucopia. Emily ran all the way to the back of the train until running through the train's open connectors got her soaking wet and drenched in rainwater. Emily waited in the back train carriage for what felt like hours went by, until Noah from -1 appeared around the corner. Emily easily killed Noah and hid in the carriage waiting for other tributes to come, but none came. Instead, Emily's victory was announced. Emily had no idea she had won until the hovercraft came to pick her up. After the games, Emily returned home where she was celebrated for bringing home yet another victory for District -1. Eventually, Emily moved to District 14, where she met Luca Vasile and married him the next year, the year of the 25th Hunger Games. Luca and Emily had 4 kids together, 3 girls and 1 boy. So yeah, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Tales of Xebec. Just like last time, I'll be showing you guys the information slides for the victors mentioned in this episode, after the outro is complete. Next episode will be the 21st through the 30th Hunger Games. Hope y'all stick around for that, and other future vids. Bye, everyone.